I'm Natasha Vitamore, and this is the H Plus Academy Roundtable. Our featured guest is Dr. Michael Rose. Michael is an evolutionary biologist and an expert in the field of gerontology. Thank you.
So the Aristotelian view is that aging is a physiological process of cumulative damage, disharmony, disruption, and so on, which almost everyone believes, except evolutionary biologists. And starting in 1941, with a book by J.B.S. Haldane, one of my academic grandfathers, evolutionary biologists instead proposed that evolution by natural selection could do whatever it wanted with lifespan and health, but in species like ourselves, which have a very distinct somatic body, as opposed to our germline and our gametes, that in species like us, natural selection ends up like Clark Gable at the end of Gone with the Wind, eventually just tiring of Scarlett O'Hara and walking away from her. And similarly, we are progressively abandoned by natural selection. And this basic idea has been the foundation of my research over the last 46 years. And one of the first experiments I did in 1977 was to test this theory in a, completely high stakes experiment where I supposed that, well, if this theory is true about natural selection really being the determinant of everything and not any particular piece of machinery breaking down, then I should be able to find a way to change the focus of natural selection toward later survival. And I tried it and it worked. And I think that was the breakthrough that really changed my relationship to the field of aging, from one of the idle curiosity of a then 22-year-old to a pretty dedicated worker in the fields of gerontology. Complexity. There are many of those same complex animals and plants have telomeres, they have free radical damage, they have all of the molecular causes of damage and disruption and the cellular causes of damage and disruption that we do, but they do not age. And those are the species that evolution by natural selection predicts should not age in the core evolutionary theory. And their key feature is that they divide by splitting in two, and there's no distinction between their somatic bodies and their germlines. And of course, evolution has sustained vertebrate germlines and thus vertebrate cell lineages for hundreds of millions of years, well within the capacity of evolution by natural selection to sustain life indefinitely with no detectable aging. So the reason why we are not so favored is because we break that unity of germline and somatic form. And that means that if there's a trade-off to be made between indefinite somatic survival and the total productivity of our germline, then natural selection signs up for that deal. That deal is something I call antagonistic pleiotropy, but you can think of it as trade-offs between aging and total reproduction. And in organisms like ourselves, all vertebrates, all insects, this trade-off is quite strong, hard, and fast. And that's the core insight that the evolutionary theory that we've had for the last 80 years has been predicated on.
Well, does that mean that aging is inevitable? Is it an inevitable feature of life?
Well, specifically, it means aging is not an inevitable feature of life. Categorically not, since we have organisms like hydra, sea anemones, some jellyfish, some trees like trembling aspen, bushes like creosote bushes.
But those,
do not
yeah,
age at
they're
all.
not part of the Homo sapiens sapiens, evolutionary trail. I mean, since hominids and whatnot. But so what you're saying is some life forms,
Mhm.
aging is not inevitable, but in
Right.
humans, is aging inevitable? Bottom line.
Aging is an inevitable feature of life for all mammals.
Now that finally the whole genome has been sequenced, we know just what last year was it, the last 8% was it, that
Mhm.
did get sequenced, but in the X chromosome and not in the human, but that's pretty darn good. So we can pretty much say that the whole genome has been sequenced. So what next? What did we learn from that? We thought it was going to be, oh my God, we'll finally get all of our genes sorted out. Now the end of disease, the end of aging, we're here.
Mhm.
We've
Right.
accomplished it. We've reached the summit.
Mhm.
What happened?
What happened is that the assumptions of 20th century reductionist cell molecular biology are false, almost always. It's like the geocentric theory is almost always false, except for the moon and some artificial satellites. Basically, the way genomes produce transcriptomes, produce metabolites, and coordinate how our organ systems function is extremely complex. It is nothing like the assumptions that people like James Watson or Craig Venter had when they sold NIH on the project of sequencing the entire human genome. If their worldview had been correct, then yes, we would have solved all of our problems with chronic disease. As their worldview is 95% or more wrong, uh, of course, the sequencing of the human genome marked the start of our process of figuring out all the controls on major disease and aging.
So here's something that you just, I didn't have it in my mind that I was going to talk to you about this, but I think it's really important. You mentioned worldview. The worldview in the longevity industry,
Mhm.
in healthcare, the medical industry by and large, and in the culture of life extensionists is pretty much reductionist. There is a problem. How do we change the mindset of people so that they will be brighter, more apt to ask questions and not follow that slippery slope or, the Pied Piper down this trail?
Fantastic question, Natasha. I wish I had a simple answer for that.
Mm,
I mean, it's an aphorism of physics that physics advances with the death of one physicist at a time, because people over a certain age are very reluctant to change their views, their long-held opinions and convictions. And I would say, especially if those convictions are both simple and psychologically comforting. I think that's really the foundation of the anti-aging business we have now, is you have a both um, non-industrial followers who of the anti-aging movement who really want simple answers and say, take metformin and these 3 supplements and you'll be good. And similarly, companies that hope to come up with anti-aging drugs or anti-aging cell treatments want to sell simple uh, technologies to first their investors and then their clients. Um, in a sense, the last 100 years of experimental aging research, which really got going in the 19 teens, um, has been a kind of unending struggle between those who really avidly sought simple answers and the people primarily from my discipline, but not only from my discipline of evolutionary biology, who've long contended that the mechanistic features of aging are complex. And over those entire 100 years, the simple answer people have lost over and over again, unless you're a nematode. If you're a nematode, you have a spectacular um, age-defying mechanism, Dower formation, and its
mhm.
related forms of metabolic arrest or attenuation. So if you're a nematode, yeah, by all means, subscribe to what Cynthia Kenyon and Calico have to say. Unfortunately, I think most of the people listening today are not nematodes, and they don't have such a spectacular metabolic arrest or hibernation pathway that can be tweaked to produce 4 to 10 times the lifespan length. Um, so for us, the sort of 95% of organisms, as it were, the answers are genomically complex. And I do not assert this a priori or from theoretical considerations the way it used to be by people in my field, starting in the 1950s, because starting in 2010, in this obscure journal, Nature, my lab and other labs have been showing over and over again that the genomic foundations of aging are quite complex. Then that's being followed up by papers on the transcriptomics of aging, which shows that that's at least as complex as the genomics.
Mhm.
And now we have a paper on bioarchive. Barter is the first author, Barter, which shows that the interconnections between the genome and the transcriptome are even more complex.
Mhm.
So you actually have hundreds of differentiated genomic sites. You have hundreds of differentiated transcripts to produce a much longer-lived organism. And then you have thousands of interconnections between those hundreds of different types of differentiation on those two omic levels. Then you also have metabolomic differentiation, which is also very complex. There's no simplicity to be had at the level of mechanism. The only profound simplicity is to be found at the level of evolutionary theory, by which I do not mean fecal storytelling,
Mhm.
bovine fecal storytelling. I mean the math. Evolutionary theory runs off math, like real science always does, whether it's economics or physics. And evolutionary genetics is one of the most powerful and beautiful theories in the world. And it supplies very profound and powerful math on what the deal is with aging, why it exists, how long it lasts, how to postpone it, and even how to make it stop.
So
You've
that
got all
brings
that stuff.
us to the machine learning. But before we get there, let me ask you something. And this ties into the scope of what we're talking about. Today, again, we're talking about the culture and worldviews, but there's a consensus of individuals who are practicing biohacking and DIY, and they're looking at the latest vitamins that they're going to conferences. They say these are the best ones to take, and these interventions and AD, and we already mentioned metformin. Well, let me say, how do you address this? What is your view on the growth of biohacking and DIYers in longevity?
Well, on the one hand, it's inspiring. It's like a lot of the various hacks that people had in mind for dealing with contagious disease, starting in the 18th century. Like Casanova was a biohacker for venereal disease for very good reasons.
That's good.
He caught a lot of venereal diseases, and he discovered that I think it was both mercury and arsenic would kill off the pathogens that he was infected with. Now, he didn't really understand what was going on because he didn't know any microbiology.
Mhm.
Microbiology really got going in the 19th century. And basically, the development of the science of microbiology from around 1820 to around 1920 obliterated all of the conventional views on disease, contagious disease, and the most of the biohacks that were being used starting in the 18th century. But once you know microbiology, once you can see the microbes with good microscopes, once you can culture the microbes, once you know how to manipulate microbial infection, all the sort of biohacking on contagious disease becomes kind of pathetic. And I will note historically that the COVID pandemic brought an upsurge in biohacking with respect to contagious disease, which really was almost completely counterproductive. So the thing I like about biohacking on aging is it shows people are interested, shows people have hope, and occasionally they'll be right, almost to the level of random, but probably below the level of random, because most of what the biohackers believe is systematically false, because many of them buy into the now devastatingly falsified views.
I think there's got to be a simpler way to just say, at its very core, this doesn't work. What I wanted to ask you is, there's a couple of things in just thinking about our friendship over the years, and you have children, and in the maybe you said, maybe one article I was reading some months ago, is that maybe the Victorians got it right about sex, and that and with your own research,
Asha,
theory.
I have to stop you there on 2 points. So like graduate students, we let our uh, uh, flies that we make evolve postponed aging. We let them have all the sex they want. What we do is we get in their way of their successful reproduction. And it turns out that once you produce this much longer lived fruit fly, its total reproductive output is greater.
Right, and you've even said that allow them to have as much fun as they want at that point, and yeah, so it's an interesting psychology, but it brings in a couple of things. First, is there something to be said about mind over matter that you find enticing or intriguing, whether it does affect epigenetics or if it's just a psychology that will push progress forward by default?
So you raised 2 questions. One is immortality, which I'll get to second,
Mhm.
and the other one is mind over matter. So the actual data, if you look at metabolomes and transcriptomes, I think is pretty clear that a lot of things you do with your body, from nutrition to exercise to a better attitude, will alter your metabolome and your transcriptome. They won't alter your genome, but they
Mhm.
will alter your transcripts and your metabolites. And some of those, we don't know which, some of those mental attitudes might increase your lifespan. But that is also in the biohacking category.
Mhm.
Now, let me turn to immortality. Immortality really is the cat among the pigeons with respect to the issue of aging, because the cell molecular Aristotelian assumptions about this cumulative physiological process are devastatingly falsified by the fact that in quite a few cohorts that have been studied in detail, aging stops at later ages, exactly at the point in chronological age when you would expect the aging process to then finally administer the coup de grace and kill us off. That's when aging actually stops. Aging by a whole bunch of measures, age-specific mortality rates, age-specific fecundities, and a whole variety of physiological functions, which in terms of the conventional theories makes no sense whatsoever. But the evolutionary genetic theory can explain it beautifully and powerfully, mathematically. And furthermore, in my lab, we have changed the age at which aging stops. In other words, we've changed the age at which you have a transition from aging to a period of immortality, where immortality to a biologist means the stabilization of death rates and declining function. It doesn't mean you become younger. That's rejuvenescence, a
Mhm.
different
Right.
process. So immortality, as I've already said, is a very real thing in biology. There are lots of animals that are biologically immortal, and more stunningly still, 30 years ago, we discovered that lots of animals stop aging late in life, which we can make sense of in terms of the evolutionary genetic theory, which cannot be made sense of in terms of the reductionist theory, which doesn't make sense in terms of almost everything that people are told on YouTube by noted gerontologists.
Thus, your interest in the omnics, all the different elements within biology, and synthesizing that and sorting it out, machine learning is essential. We can't do it at the level of our own thinking processes, and to assume that we can is a misnomer. It takes us again down that slippery slope, and it's just, into an area of nonsense. that just doesn't work. And I think that, looking back at this time, we'll be, really excited about the longevity, environment, and worldview, et cetera. But knowing that unless and until that complexity is sorted out by something greater than the aptitude and ability and processing power of the human brain, we're kind of in a conundrum. So what do we do?
The what do we do
Mm,
in the genomic era has been the biggest focus of my lab over the last 20 years. So the first thing is experimental evolution, which is one of my main techniques, not my only technique, easily produces animals which age very slowly versus age very quickly. And you can then use what's called genomics and transcriptomics, which is actually a fairly high order kind of statistical package to sort out what the key causal factors are at each level of omic organization, from genome to transcriptome to metabolome, which is the start. But because that reveals vast complexity, the only way you can sort out that vast complexity is machine learning, which lay people call AI, artificial intelligence, which I prefer to call artificial stupidity. But I think what a lot of people, I mean, fewer and fewer all the time, but a lot of people still don't realize is we live in a golden age of machine learning. Up until about the year 2000, science and technology and even business practices ran on a spectrum of tools which were chiefly analytical or involved simple statistical tools like analysis of variance and linear regression. Over the last 20 years, we've transitioned to an age in which machine learning is taking over everything, from accounting analytics, business logistics. Every time you do a Google search, it's being done for you with machine learning tools. We live surrounded by machine learning. Our cars are using machine learning. That's the whole point of Tesla full self-driving, so-called. I wouldn't trust it yet. So in fact, it turns out that applying machine learning to genomic complexity is an excellent application for machine learning. It's almost as if we evolved to be perfect subjects for a machine learning approach to solving our problems.
And that certainly will counter the mindset of false certainties. You mentioned Tesla. It's a false certainty that Tesla is green. Batteries do need to charge, and the mechanisms by which batteries charge need to be energized. And so if you look at even disposing of the battery and the energy to charge the battery, all of that, you get into where it isn't green technology. And the second part of that is the assumption that Teslas are the perfect car, but the approach is great. The enthusiasm is great. All of that, the worldview around Tesla is great. But the fact is that it isn't a fait accompli, that it does fall into that category of false certainties that can be, not always, but can be very dangerous to us. So we're almost at the half of the hour, just right there, we'll past it. I'd like to bring in a couple of people to ask questions of you, and I'll chime in as well. I'm going to ask Max Moore here.
Yeah, I had two or three questions. Just to follow up on what you're saying about machine learning. It seems, this is what I read. I'm not an expert in the area, but my understanding is that machine learning has been applied to the genomes of supercentenarians with the expectation that it reveals some interesting cluster of genes that would explain why they live more than 100. But from what I hear, that hasn't actually produced any useful results. Do you think it's just that that's the wrong way, that they're looking at the wrong way, or that machine learning is not going to reveal answers in that, or there's nothing special about supercentenarians?
I'm going to give an all of the above answer. So firstly, we actually did a project on centenarian genomics and how good centenarian data are likely to be for parsing genomes. And the short answer from that publication, Burke, B-U-R-K-E, is the first author, is that centenarian data is not really as wonderful as people might think. We have developed other approaches in which basically, to simplify enormously, the greater the diversity and heterogeneity you have genomically, and the greater the number of genomes you have, the greater genomic penetration you're going to get using machine learning or any other analytical tool. What you really need to prosper with machine learning and genomics is either very powerfully differentiated subgroups, which centenarians really aren't. They don't live that much longer than the average lifespan. Or you need vast numbers of individuals. Now, the beauty of the modern world is we're collecting whole genome data on hundreds of thousands of humans. I think we may have passed the million mark, and combining millions of genomes of humans with their corresponding clinical records will be the key for machine learning to figure out the mechanistic machinery underlying human aging.
But I think super centenarians, people over 100, what was the definition, over 110, maybe somewhat different than those over 100. So, but of course, there are very few of them. So maybe that's not a good target yet. But as population keeps aging, perhaps the numbers will reach a level where machine learning can tell us something, perhaps.
Well, very simply, mo data, mo better. And the problem with focusing particularly on centenarians and super centenarians, there just aren't enough of them yet. I would much rather have sequence data from all around the world, from people in Australia, India, Africa, North and South America, Europe, who have a whole variety of health outcomes, and where we have their whole genome sequenced. I think that's the way to go.
All right. I want to kind of a brief one, because you've talked about this a bit, but just to clarify, whenever people use the term immortality, it makes me kind of cringe in most cases. You know, the press using it in the headlines, as they always do, even when I ask them not to, that I'm not, you know, alcohol, we're not selling immortality, for instance, we're giving a chance at more life. But you have a very specific meaning when you say biological immortality. Could you, for those who are not familiar with that, explain that a little more?
Right. So I first must say this is completely conventional usage. This usage has been around since before I entered the field, 46 years ago. Biological immortality means an organism that does not age at all, but can die. So, sea anemones 6 miles away from me in the tidal pools and the coastline of Orange County can live there forever for thousands of years, or I could go out and kill one of them this afternoon by stepping on it. That's biological immortality. But there are other flavors of immortality, which I'll be talking about at RADFest in a couple of weeks. There's negligible senescence, not my term. It's one popularized by Caleb Finch at USC in Los Angeles. And negligible senescence is when an animal or a plant might undergo an aging process, but it's a relatively small factor in its pattern of death. So this is true of sequoia trees. This is true of a lot of tortoise species. This is apparently true of some sharks, certainly some clams. So these are animals and plants that I think almost certainly undergo an aging process, but their aging process is a trivial contributor to their patterns of death. That's called negligible senescence. And thirdly, we have post-aging, cessation of aging, which has only been well documented over the last 30 years. Although I will say the first organism where this was really, I think, well established numerically was humans in a 1939 paper, which was based on data from hundreds of thousands of Europeans. So contrary to the Aristotelian reductionist assumptions that prevail among all the journalists you talk to, aging isn't endless and inevitable. It actually stops on its own, given the chance. And I will comment that humans in modern societies only stop aging very, very late at 105, current estimates suggest, which leaves us with so few people that there isn't enough good data on them. So essentially in humans, we almost never observe the cessation of aging because we have, through the latter half of the 20th century, not stopped aging until after the age of 100, a point in time at which almost all of us are dead. But there are other species, like the fruit flies I work with, that stop aging much earlier. And that phenomenon of the cessation of aging can be studied quite well, which we have done in my lab over the last 20 years and has been published many times. If you go to my Google Scholar page, Michael R. Rose, you'll see dozens of publications on the cessation of aging in late life.
So, Michael, let me ask you, and I was just reviewing the questions in the chat, and I think most of them you've already answered. Some of them would fall into the category of reductionist, apologetic thinking. What can we do now? I mean, putting everything aside, do you think that there is a possibility that if you make it to a specific age and then go back to your ancestral diet, like a paleo diet or whatever your particular ancestry is, that you could prolong it even further? And if that's the case, what if there is no possible way that you can sustain just because the applications of machine learning are too slow, or the politicization or polarization of information in allowing people to live longer is negated? Let's just take those scenarios. What do you suggest people do?
As I like to say, you can get onto a better aging trajectory this evening. You don't have to wait for research in anybody's lab. The third phase is, I have more specific things to say about the third phase in that 4 steps article. So and this is modeled on, this article discusses explicitly how this was already done over the last 80 years. Once the microbiologists had won their victory over all conventional beliefs about contagious disease, circa 1920, they then spent 80 years coming up with things like antibiotics, vaccinations, and so on, long before everything was figured out about the machinery of infectious pathogens, adaptive immune systems. Only recently we discovered the innate immune system. All that stuff is the great and legendary work of the 20th century that gave us radically increased lifespans. So the first part of that 80-year stretch from about 1920 to 1960, we really, as biologists, didn't know the details of what we were doing, but we found a bunch of stuff that worked. That's my third step for aging. And I think there's been enough thrashing around by biohackers and cell molecular reductionists that their random explorations, theoretically uninformed, if not theoretically counterproductive, have given us a variety of potential tools, like possible pharmaceutical interventions. I think one of the best established is lithium, which has been established both experimentally and from human epidemiological data, that low-dose lithium is one of the best established drugs for increasing lifespan. But that's like, we accidentally discovered that penicillin kills microbes. And we didn't know why. We didn't know what penicillin was, et cetera, but it worked. And that saved a lot of lives starting in the 1940s. The fourth step will be, once we have the powerful machine learning really revealing what's going on, I think that will happen faster than anybody now understands. I think instead of having 40 years of thrashing around between 2020 and 2060, it might be 10 to 15 years of thrashing around. And my hope is that in the 2030s, the machine learning will start to pay off and we'll really be able to figure out mechanistically and powerfully exactly what to do in the same way that, from the 1960s with the discovery of DNA, RNA, and all the machinery of life, and in particular, discovery of mechanisms by which antibiotics and vaccines work, we became really smart at using first antibiotics, then antivirals, which really got contagious disease on the run. And that's the reason why so many people survived.
Our featured guest is Dr. Michael Rose, who examines what could be the single most important change to slow down and stop aging.
It's a real pleasure to speak to Michael. Such an honor to be alongside the person who really established the plasticity of aging, refuting the dogma that had been there before. So I'm very interested in what deep learning might do, machine learning, and share your enthusiasm that it could be on the point of giving us lots of new insights that was not apparent from a more reductionist point of view. But I wonder, what exactly are you expecting to get out of this deep learning? Is it what the CEO of DeepMind, Demis Hassabis, recently talked about? Because DeepMind recently had a remarkable breakthrough, as we know, with predicting how proteins would fold. But he says, well, that's only the start. What he has in mind, this is what he said in a podcast interview with Lex Friedman recently, what he had in mind is within 10 years, they will not just have a model of a single protein, they'll have a model of all the constituents of the cell. And they'll be able to accurately model exactly what's going on inside the cell. And when they can do that, they'll be able to understand much more quickly what's the right move, what's the right intervention. And going beyond that, maybe another 10 years, although he's very open about the timescales, it won't just be a model of an individual cell, it'll be a complete model of entire organs and all the interactions there. Is that the kind of thing you've got in mind, or is there something else as to what deep learning will deliver for us in 10 years' time or so?
Well, thank you for that beautiful outline of the progress that's being made and the immediate prospects, thanks to Google's DeepMind. I think aging is a more focal problem than I think, ironically, the reductionists realize. I've been used to, in my interactions with reductionists over the last 40 years, to them thinking thoughts like, well, we have to really figure out all these many complex questions about cell physiology and organ physiology. And I'm delighted whenever anybody makes progress on those fronts. But when we produce much longer lived animals in our lab, they're only on the order of 200 sites in the genome you have to tinker with. And, we have in humans around 20,000 conventional genes, and we have on the order of 50 to 100,000 total transcripts in our transcriptome. I don't think you have to solve all of that stuff to powerfully understand aging, and then secondly, with that powerful understanding, to powerfully intervene. I think that the trajectory that DeepMind is on is spectacular for biology. That's really, the reductionists are loath to admit this, but basically genomics, transcriptomics, the omics, and machine learning, AI, are taking over biology completely, in the same way that modern physics took over conventional physics going from 1905 to 1945. Biology will never be the same again, the way it was before 1997 and the start of the genomic revolution. And by genomic, I mean the entire genome, because it's entire genomes and entire transcriptomes that are the key to unraveling all the problems in biology. But I really don't think we have to wait for the solution of all the major problems in biology to make spectacular progress with aging and its associated diseases.
So let me ask.
So will that include things like
Go ahead, David.
like senolytics? There seems to be quite encouraging results There were a few disappointing trials initially by Unity Biotechnology, but their more recent results just a few months ago seem to be encouraging again. So this is an intervention. It's understanding genes, but then figuring out here's a way to recognize senolytic cells and remove them. Is that the kind of thing you have in mind as the solution, rather than reprogramming our genes, that we can get more healthy longevity by that kind of intervention?
Okay, the best simple answer I can give you is that I think a huge range of technologies that have been created by cell molecular biologists over the last 40 years will need to be brought to bear. And because to me, the control and large defeat of human aging is an Apollo or NASA scale project. It's not a Jules Verne project. It's not like you do one thing and then suddenly everything's great. It's you do many things very carefully orchestrated by people who really understand how to get complex missions accomplished, not people who place their hope in simple interventions. And part of my motivation for being that optimistic about the defeat of aging is we did this with contagious disease. You know, first we spent 80 years fighting over what's the correct science. That was over by about 1920. Then we spent the next 80 years effectively defeating contagious disease so that it became a minor problem in human mortality and debilitation. Still a problem, but a minor problem. My belief is that over the next, I think less than 80 years, 40 to 60 years, we will do the same thing with human aging. And we will do it using many, many tools where the master science, the science playing the role of microbiology, is evolutionary biology, not cell biology. Because evolutionary biologists have really figured out aging. We can make it do almost whatever we want in a laboratory. And now we really need the chance to introduce these ideas into the large-scale practice of medicine, especially, of course, the medicine focused on aging-associated diseases. You had to give over the conquest of contagious disease to the microbiologists to make progress. You had to take it away from the miasmaticists, a group of people now no one talks about, but were the dominant forces in the conventional medical treatment of aging all through the 19th century, were wiped out by people like Pasteur and Koch, among others. So similarly, we have to take away the power of the kind of people who run the NIA, kind of people that they fund, and give it to the evolutionary biologists to make technological progress with the defeat of aging. I really think that the genuine scientific debate is over, and in the next 80 years, or ideally less, we have to focus on the technology grounded in the correct science.
Do you think that we are still needing better tools from the fourth industrial revolution, better tools to act on the insights of evolutionary biologists, and these are what, when nanotechnology matures a bit further and information technology matures a bit further, then we'll make faster progress?
Exactly. You have just stated my view precisely. And, starting in 1980, once I fully realized the genomic complexity of aging, I spent about 20 years waiting for the genomic revolution. And it finally had happened. And I now live in a biologist's paradise of genomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, and all kinds of new powerful nanotech technologies that will be foundational for the conquest of aging.
You just touched on something, Michael. Nanomedicine, the most recent book by Rob Freitas, Biostasis Revival, is focused on biocompatibility and looking at these technologies that I look forward to the actual release of nanomedicine at the scale that he has written about and he talks about. If you were to ask leading universities whose research teams claim to work in the area of nanotechnology or nanomedicine, and you ask them precisely what they're talking about molecular biology. They're not talking about nanorobotics, which is what Friedis is talking about. And that nanorobotics, the leaps that Friedis has made is focused on the biocompatibility. That seems to be the primer, it seems to be the core focus. And I think that's a really smart turn, because a lot of the issues with human enhancement and invasive enhancement have been concerned with, have kind of swayed away from it in the field of bioethics since the Beyond Therapy report. And now it's come full circle where we're looking at, machine learning. And Craig Venter, for example, got into AI some years ago, and he was saying that without AI, it's just a bunch of information, a bunch of data that can't be assimilated. But you're taking it to another step. You're not just talking about the assimilation of data and sorting through it, and it's beyond the reductionist sensibility to the complexity theory in this approach. But to bring it back home to some of the questions that the attendees are asking, what can we do now? Gennady asked a question. He says, what is the best case scenario for increases to lifespans of those people who are alive today, assuming sufficient funding, public support, and all other necessary factors aligning to make the approach as successful as it can be? I think you answered that a little bit earlier with diet and knowing your ancestral tree. In your 4 steps, it was number 2. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think working on step 3 is almost a no-brainer. I think basically the AI-oriented molecular tech community is right on the threshold of figuring out stuff that works for reasons that they don't understand, but the machine learning will tell them that they work. And the key to that is not focusing on centenarians, but taking everybody's or a huge number of people's genomes and transcriptomes and their history of pharmacological use and their detailed health outcomes and letting machine learning sort out the details. I think we're right on the threshold of doing precisely that. I think, I mean, I know 2 organizations that are very close. That's NHS in England and Kaiser Permanente in California are very close to doing stuff like that. And that doesn't mean, that we should passively wait for their insights. I think that there will be ways, corporate and otherwise, to join into that revolution. I'm interested in, I'm retiring next year from the university. I'm giving up on the academic and scientific life of disputation with no consequence. And I'm interested in being part of that step 3 machine learning revolution to find the best appropriate hacks, not biohack, but omic AI hacks, because they are almost certainly out there.
You could just do this briefly. Define omics for all attendees here. I think it's a term that has not been used widely, if at all. It's a suffix, and that suffix has a big community. It's a could you just define it?
Yeah. So genomics is the study of all the DNA sequences in a genome, in the nucleus of a germ cell. Transcriptomics is the study of all the transcripts that are made from a genome. And all those transcripts are, of course, RNA, and everything in the genome is DNA. And then all the transcripts together orchestrate the functioning of all the metabolites, which is a hugely diverse collection of molecules, which function not only within cells, but between cells, and orchestrate everything that's going to go on. And among, for example, those important metabolites are hormones. So omics is all of those. Omics is the study of genomics together with transcriptomics, together with metabolomics. And that's been our specific interest over the last 5 years. We moved on from genomics to omics, And we moved on from merely genomic analysis of how do you make an animal live much longer to the complete omic hierarchy at all of those. There are other omic levels. They're called proteomics, for example, which is study of all proteins. There are lipidomics, which is a subset of metabolomics, which is study of all the lipids in the body, and there are many, many kinds of lipids. But basically, I amalgamate all of that into the universe of omics, which is literally impossible for the human brain to make any headway with. The only way you can sort out omics is with machine learning. That's the only conceivable tool that will do it. And you add into that omic machine learning stew information about people's health outcomes, including the health outcomes of biohackers. If there are enough of them using metformin off-label, well, that goes into the data hopper, that goes into the machine learning, and the machine learning will actually delineate whether or not that's working. So right now, well, I shouldn't say right now, I have any number of friends, for example, in the Los Angeles Gerontology Research Group, who have been functioning at the Casanova level of trying stuff out on themselves without having adequate omic and machine learning resources. Mike Lustgarten at Tufts is, I think, the world's leading biohacker, and he has a very good YouTube page, and he is a sample of one, which is Mike Lustgarten. And he does fantastic work on Mike Lustgarten, but he's being held back by the fact that he just doesn't have enough data, both omic data. He doesn't have enough people's health outcome data, but we're just about to do this. I mean, if I were a biohacker, my number one goal right now would be to stop biohacking and try to get into some type of omic AI project and let the people doing the machine learning sort out which hacks are the best hacks right now. Okay, so I'll give you a concrete example from, so in Pasteur's work, the appropriate lifestyle changes were number one, washing your hands, number two, eating food that wasn't infected with bacteria, number three, avoiding viral contamination by anything from wearing scarves to whatever. Then there were some hacks. So vaccination was a hack in the 19th century. Nobody really knew why it worked, but it worked. And it worked powerfully enough for people to accumulate clinical data supporting the use of vaccination all through the 19th century against the avid resistance of all the miasmaticists who thought that vaccination was insane. Okay? So in exactly the same way, the various hacks that people like Mike Lustgarten and others have thought of can go into this massive omic AI process where we can sort out which hacks are like vaccination for aging before we even figure out all the details of how they work. So I think this decade will be a golden age for hacks chosen on the basis of machine learning operating off of full-scale omic and healthcare outcome data.
Well said. You know, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the foods that could kill you are the most rapidly available foods in our world, and they're quick fixes. About our own hacking, the best hacking we can do today is that first to know your ancestry, then, you know, whatever diet works best for you, and to also apply omnics within psychology too, and attitude and the lifestyle that you have, because it is so precious to us, not to just be waiting for the next big fix or to find out what someone that is a star in the longevity community is saying, but to listen to those of us who are saying, whoa, settle down, you know, don't do it unless you have to. Don't get that stem cell therapy, those gene editing therapies, the surgeries until you really need it. Then it would be an intervention that is needed rather than doing the haphazard hacking. Not that anyone is doing haphazard hacking, but we all are to a degree because we simply do not know. I wonder how the thinking process fits into that. I mean, it's a lot of what we eat and what we subscribe to is based on our socioeconomic political views. And by and large, influenced by our peers and often manipulated by that information. So it's really important to be careful what you pay attention to and where you situate yourself. Because you're an evolutionary biologist, chronological age is very important. But for most of us, we want to be ageless thinkers and not be so concerned about what we're supposed to do at 30 or 40 or 50 or 60. But it's also very important when we're thinking about certain elements and aspects of our biology. Do you think that one day that we will move beyond our biology, or do you think that we will always, our species will always be biological?
Well, let me talk about the first part where I have a lot of opinions, and then I'll address the second part where I don't have very firm opinions. So, like, always having to think about aging, thinking about ancestry and all this stuff. We've been through this before. The way people lived before 1870 in terms of contagious disease is a world that most of us would find nightmarish. People didn't wash dishes. People didn't wash utensils. People didn't wash their hands between the latrine and the dining room, okay? Much of modern culture has been rebuilt in light of ideas from microbiologists. Our lives are now very much influenced by ideas of microbiologists, ideas that started to be propounded in 1840 and became quite prevalent in advanced industrialized countries by 1920. Exactly the same thing will happen with respect to aging and evolutionary biology. People 50 years from now will be routinely thinking in terms of their ancestry, in terms of what their ancestors ate. They'll be routinely thinking in terms of what their genome tells them they should be doing. And we won't be ageless in the sense of heedless. We will be ageless only to the extent to which we are thoughtful. Okay, now, will we always be biological? Well, those of us who choose to be biological will remain biological. Those of us who would rather invest our time in an online avatar controlled by, some type of metaverse corporation, well, you can choose that as well. I think an irony of our time is that many of us are busy building online identities which will survive our biological forms. We've already started that migration.
Now we're getting to a nexus of a discussion that ties into deep learning, and it ties into both the resilience of human adaptation and the incredible magnitude in which the potential for AI through machine learning and other approaches not yet realized is that we need the machines in order to function to the high capacity. But even with nanorobots, those robots are not biological. We've never been exclusively human. We evolved with mitochondria, which share a different DNA. But in the future, we will evolve, don't you think? Are you biology centric?
No, because I'm on Facebook, for one thing. I'm on YouTube. I've published millions of words over the course of my career. I'm about to publish my 11th academic book. The concept of the noosphere from Desjardins.
Yes, of course, Chardin, yeah.
Right. So humans have been building a noosphere since we first did cave paintings. This is an
I think that the fallacy that you're talking about is right now people are spending so much time building avatars and games and going into virtual worlds and excited about the metaverse rather than thinking about their own longevity. However, you do agree that, of course, we're going to be synergistically incorporating or coexisting with nanorobotics and other systems to enrich our lives, both in this biosphere, but also in space and in other environments. But it's not binary. It's not one or the other, that it's a confluence of possibilities.
We've always been both for at least 40 or 50,000 years. We've been both cultural, which I think is the biggest basket term for everything we're talking about, and biological. We are, in that sense, the most cultural of all species.
Mhm. It's interesting when culture wants to go into a direction like being an influencer and spend all your time within these environments. It's, something that is taking us away from the core reality of what we need to face. And in the longevity community, in this not only industry that is financed by lots of money and pretty signs and very smart marketing about what's going to be the next big thing, but there's part of me that also just spend my time as a researcher and the scientist part of me to be involved in something that is more meaningful in the long run. And I think that could be what's driving you away from the academics into your own area that you will announce at some point. I think that's really wonderful, Michael, and I'm enormously excited about it. You've always been a hero. Going back to when we met in the late 1990s, someone I do pay attention to. And I see that where you pivot, I pay attention to those pivots.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I think, look, the great thing about what's happened over the last 20 years is that the idea of intervening in aging has become a popular enthusiasm, which it was not in the year 2000.
Right.
The primary person responsible for that is Aubrey de Grey, but he's not the only person.
Mhm.
However, a cultural enthusiasm is different from accomplishing a project. All right.
Yeah.
So, for example, Jules Verne wrote a celebrated novel about traveling to the moon and coming back. What few people realize is Casanova wrote a book about that in the 18th century as well. But basically, the idea of traveling to the moon and back became a popular enthusiasm fueled by science fiction, okay, from the 1870s to the 1950s. And then massive technology was thrown at the problem by both the United States and the then Soviet Union. And the United States accomplished the objective using massive technology and the coordination of huge teams of people for a goal that people were excited about. Well, now we have, I think in some ways more appropriately, a very widespread surging enthusiasm for the idea of really controlling or conquering aging, in the same way that in the 19th century there was a massive enthusiasm for the control of contagious disease. And furthermore, all of my experience as a scientist says we can now do that. We now have enough tools, we now have enough scientific knowledge, and the scientific knowledge comes from the evolutionary biology of aging, not cell molecular reductionism, not cytogerontology. That's the miasma of our time. But eventually the correct science wins. And once it's won, then technological progress greatly accelerates, vastly accelerates, because it's being used appropriately, not inappropriately.
Right.
So senolytics are not the vaccine technology of our time. I'm not saying they're useless technologies. I think they're useful technologies, but I don't think that that's the immediate hack that most of us should be using. The first hack I think most of us should be using is diet, lifestyle, and tribe, which we haven't talked about, but that's a very, very important part of the psychology of it. And then with the vast databases of omics and vast healthcare databases and health outcome databases, we can find the next phase of hacks, step 3 in my 4-step plans. And as we are doing all that stuff, I think we will, with remarkable speed, transition to the 4th step, where we really know exactly what's going on, in the same sense that the microbiology of the 1970s and 80s really knew what it was doing with vaccination, with antibiotics, and with antivirals, with detecting bacteria and viruses, the whole 9 yards. I think that will actually happen with greater speed than I believed in 2016, just 6 years ago.
The exponential aspect of it, yes. So in closing, let me ask you, for all of us here, we know your 4 steps, but what can we do right now? What can we say? What can we inform? How can we educate others? I don't want to refer to a paper, I want to refer to a phrase. Maybe something that is a no-nonsense phrase or something that will trigger a greater desire to not go over here when we need to be over there, or to find the direction.
Sure, actually, your challenge has provoked a thought in me. So after 1920, the best advice you could give to those who wanted to avoid contagious disease was to base your lifestyle and your medical interventions on microbiology. I would say that over the next 80 years, the best simple hack, the fundamental step you have to take, is to base your approach on remedying your aging on the evolutionary biology of aging. That's my one phrase. Base your health on the evolutionary biology of aging when it doesn't involve contagious disease. When it's contagious disease, base it on microbiology.
Excellent. Thank you. Does anyone have a final question to ask before I close out? Max?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind asking a question that we were talking about before everybody else came on, and I saw was also raised in the chat, so it might be good just to bring it up here, Michael, to get your view on, in terms of interventions, what do you think, how powerful or effective do you think, say, intermittent fasting of some form is? Is that something you think, you said obviously eating all the time is not a good idea, but taking that a little bit further, do you think some form of fasting or something close to it is worth doing, and at what age?
I think intermittent fasting is a component of a scientifically correct paleo diet. So for me, it folds into the paleo diet. We did not evolve to eat all the time. Now, agricultural populations sort of ate small amounts of really bad food all the time. Things like bread and cheese, like forever. And if you have European ancestry and you're under 30, you can continue to eat that way. But for those of us who are over 50, which is probably almost everybody on this call, this Zoom meeting, I think you have to abandon all your agricultural dietary practices, including the relentless eating. So intermittent fasting to me is an inherent part of a scientifically correct paleo diet.
Because intermittent fasting means a lot of different things, maybe more specifically, would that include actually not eating at all for 2 days to 5 days, or would it just mean only eating once or twice a day or something in between?
Personally, I think not eating at all for 5 days is extreme. And I think that imperils you from the standpoint of contagious disease, and that it might pose problems for the ability of your adaptive immune system to ward off disease. There was a brilliant experiment done on this. It wasn't perfectly synchronized in time, but Okinawa went through massive caloric deprivation in the 1940s, thanks to World War II. And Cambodia went through massive caloric deprivation in the late 1970s, thanks to the Khmer Rouge. And the people in Okinawa fared quite well because they lived on an isolated island, largely cut off and therefore not exposed to epidemics. The people in Cambodia fared extremely badly because a simple rhinovirus or influenza virus could come through one of those starved villages and wipe out half the population because of their lack of availability of calories and their pronounced periods of fasting. So if you're not going to live in isolation, as many of us have, and your immune system will be regularly challenged, I don't think that fasting for more than 5 days is well advised.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max. I think what we need to do next is to bring in someone, not in this session, but in the future, maybe after the first of the year when your book is published, and maybe make an announcement for this community, because it's very smart and richly developed ideas. And it's at different levels of backgrounds and intrigue, or people from all over the world. And I think that each person who participates in these meetings, whether they're here today or we're at the last one or even in our studies group, have an incredible ability to engage in information and help spread reliable information. So I think it's really important to bring in someone that is well-versed in machine learning at this level. I'm thinking of is Ben Goertzel. And I'd also like you, Michael, to suggest someone, if you would, at that point in time, so that we can keep on learning that specific route of what could happen, what will probably happen, what to be aware of, what are some of the things that could be pitfalls or bumps in the road, so to speak, to be aware of, so that we're well informed and can continue to be at the top of our game as it's continually evolving itself.
So in addition to Ben, who I think is a great choice, a colleague of mine who I work with almost every day, Larry Muller, M-U-E-L-L-E-R,
Okay.
or Lawrence D. Muller, who also knows Ben, would be a great person to talk with Ben.
I think that would be a great way to bring in a lot of people that might not know about this specifically through the Singularity Net and the deep funding, who really are interested in AI and the future of AI, but may not be so much a part of the longevity, life extension culture. And I see it as an incredible confluence of brainy minds coming together that I think would be quite wonderful when thinking about this. And I hope that it can also help to support, promote your endeavors as you leave academia. So thank you, Michael. As always, it's so lovely to spend time with you, and I always feel as part of my no BS time frame that I love so much. Just get right down to the roots of things without promoting anything other than knowledge, and to get away from the reductionist sensibility towards how the AI world is opening up this new era of genetic through deep learning. So I think that's really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Natasha. It was fun.
Thank you.